Hello, I'm Jack Shagner.
And I'm Henry Peden. We are at the C&D Canal Museum in Chesapeake City. In the mid-1650s, settlers started taking up land in the Chesapeake Bay region, opting for waterfront locations, as nearly all travel at that time was by boat. Over time, new arrivals had to migrate away from the bay to find acreage, often settling along inland streams where they put down roots. Eventually, however, as more settlers arrived, they were obliged to move further west, making travel to a trading port more difficult.
With few passable inland roads, American settlers turned to constructing artificial waterways. In 1800, there were only 26 miles of canals on the eastern seaboard, growing rapidly to 1,400 by 1830. Built in low-lying areas, flooding often caused significant damage, and during much of the winter, they were immobilized by ice. Thus, the vast majority of canals were soon superseded by railroads, but not the C&D Canal, which provided a shortcut to Baltimore. Our narrator chronicles its success.
By the late 1700s, the cities of Baltimore and Philadelphia were engaged in a trade rivalry to become the most important port on the Atlantic coast. William Penn had been promoting the growth of Pennsylvania, and many settlers had taken up land along the Susquehanna River Valley and were producing a bounty of corn, wheat, and lumber. Getting these products to a Philadelphia market, however, was seriously limited by poor roads and by the rock-strewn lower Susquehanna River, making ship transportation practically impossible. This waterway barrier, however, was about to change. In 1795, a miller by the name of Crider, living along the Juniata River near the village of Huntingdon, Pennsylvania, constructed a flat-bottomed boat of 2-inch thick planks secured together with wooden pins. He loaded it with 170 barrels of flour and successfully floated the craft down the Juniata to the Susquehanna and on to Havre de Grace. There, the flour was transferred to a ship and subsequently fetched a good price in Baltimore. Crider's craft, later to be known as an ark, was disassembled and its lumber sold. Philadelphia merchants were perturbed that Pennsylvania products, which they considered theirs, were adding to the growth of their rival city in Baltimore. So they set about examining the best way to construct a canal across the Delmarva Peninsula to move Susquehanna Valley products to the city of brotherly love. A canal between Chesapeake Bay and Delaware Bay had been envisioned for many years, and in 1799, Francis Challis produced a map depicting a number of possible routes that could be considered. Settling on a water connection location between the bays was a complicated issue. First, any route selected had to be technically feasible, and secondly, a few workable locations would receive better financial support from potential canal stockholders, as their land would benefit by the proximity of the canal. In general, locks were expensive to build, operate, and maintain, and would slow down canal traffic, so the fewer the better. These competing factors had to be balanced against the total project cost and anticipated project schedule. After some study, a cross-peninsular route was adopted. The canal would start at Welch Point on the Upper Elk River, then proceed towards Icontown, Delaware, now Glasgow, then to Bear, and finally to Mendenhall, where its termination intersected the Christiana Creek that emptied into the Delaware River. This plan required locks to traverse over a part of its course, thus needing water to replenish the higher level when vessels transitioned elevations. To supply this, in 1804, a feeder canal from Upper Big Elk Creek was initiated. But about 1 year later, all of the raised capital had been spent, and the capital project had to be abandoned. The enthusiasm of financial backers dwindled, and the start of the War of 1812 intervened. But on December 31, 1813, an editorial writer for the Gleaner newspaper noted, "The future prosperity of Philadelphia does most especially depend on opening an easy communication with the navigable waters of the Susquehanna." Other civic leaders concurred with this sentiment, but would have to wait until November 1819, when a meeting of the Canal Company announced the election of Kenzie Johns, Chief Justice of the state of Delaware, as president, along with a group of directors. Raising money, however, remained the problem until 1821, when Matthew Carey became the canal's prime mover and launched various fundraising campaigns that were marginally successful. Eventually, though, an appeal to the states brought some positive results, and by 1823, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland had pledged enough money to revive the project. Money was also raised by stock subscriptions, where the certificate identified the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal Company. But project engineers viewed the undertaking from a Philadelphia perspective, with the canal starting on the Delaware Bay and progressing westward, as reflected in numbering the sections of the design map. In 1824, construction will begin at both ends, with John Randall leading the effort at Newbold's Landing, now Delaware City, and with Simon Newton Dexter starting at what would later be Chesapeake City. Benjamin Wright, a veteran of the Erie Canal, was appointed as the C&D Canal's chief engineer. The construction of the canal began on the 15th of April, 1824, at the east end, as men with picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows carried away the soil unearthed from the channel. There, Randall paid his workers with a store-redeemable token, but found removing soil in the marshy area only allowed adjacent swampy land to slowly fill the gap. The problem would be solved by bringing in solid earth, providing for stable side bases that could support the canal channel. On the west end, Dexter began the construction of 2 tandem locks that would raise vessels 16 feet to pass through an excavated summit ridge to the east. For their foundation walls, he used granite that may have been mined in nearby Port Deposit or across the Susquehanna River in Harford County at a lapidum quarry. The most significant canal challenge, however, was digging a channel through Summit Ridge. The soil was unstable, and no sooner than it was excavated, the resulting hillsides would unleash an avalanche of debris that required additional effort to remove. The problem was further aggravated during rainstorms, when rushing downhill water swept more loose soil into the partially dug canal. To assist in the removal of the fill, animal power was employed to pull a barrel reinforced with an iron handle that could readily do the work of many men. On July 4, 1829, the union of Mr. Dashing Delaware and Miss Mary Maryland was celebrated when the waters of their bays finally joined hands under the bridge at Summit Ridge. It had been 5 years of courtship, and now future life had been spawned with the opening of a new channel of intercourse. Less than 2 weeks later, a Maryland sloop of 40 tons was the first ship to pass through the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal on its way to Philadelphia. The official opening date was set for October 17, 1829, which was announced with a broadside advising that vessels fitting into the locks of 100 by 22 feet and drawing not more than 7 feet of water would be admitted. President Andrew Jackson is perhaps best remembered today as the American officer during the War of 1812 who defeated the British on January 8, 1815 at the Battle of New Orleans. In early June 1833, President Andrew Jackson arrived at the relatively new C&D waterway, where he had expressed the desire to proceed slowly through the canal for the purpose of examining the great improvement in which the government is deeply interested. When the C&D Canal was planned, engineers had anticipated that water from Lum's Pond on the northern part of Summit Ridge would resupply water lost at the upper level of the canal by lock operations. During times of drought, however, this proved to be insufficient. Thus, in 1837, a steam-powered water pump was installed at Chesapeake City to deliver water from Back Creek into the canal's upper elevation. With increasing canal traffic, more water was required, so in 1851, a 175-horsepower steam engine was deployed that rotated a large water scoop wheel. Meanwhile, to accommodate larger vessels, in 1854 the locks were enlarged. Therefore, a second steam engine was added to provide additional resupply water. They remained in operation until 1926, when the canal became sea level, but can still be seen today in the C&D Canal Museum at Chesapeake City. On February 23, 1844, the Maryland General Assembly authorized a group of investors to create the Baltimore and Philadelphia Steamboat Company to operate through the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, carrying freight and passengers between the two cities. At the time, most steamboats were propelled by side paddles or a single stern-mounted water wheel. Neither of these techniques, however, was compatible with the 22 by 100-foot locks. So a new propulsion approach based on John Ericsson's screw propeller was adopted. Their new vessels were so successful that over the years the company became known as the Ericsson Line, which would stop along the canal at Chesapeake City, Laurelwood Grove, St. George's, and Delaware City, while on its way to Philadelphia. Opening in 1844, a lock waterway running from Wrightsville, Pennsylvania to the Maryland line, known as the Susquehanna Canal, was joined by the Tidewater Canal along Harford County that terminated in Havre de Grace. Evidenced by many of the town's magnificent houses and churches, it brought much prosperity to the area that included transshipping Susquehanna Valley products to the C&D Canal for delivery to points north, including Philadelphia. In 1872, there were 3,740 boats out of the Havre de Grace lock, with 742 going to the C&D Canal, or 20%, followed by 17% in 1873 and 23% in 1874. The cost of moving cargo is measured in dollars per ton mile, and transporting by water is the lowest cost available. Keeping this cost competitive, shipping companies resorted to larger vessels, thus prompting canal proprietors to increase the size of their locks. In July 1853, the C&D Canal hired an engineer to plan and supervise the new lock construction. He proposed 3 locks, each 220 feet long and 24 feet wide, where the 2 existing locks at Chesapeake City would be combined into a single lock with a saving basin to preserve 1/2 of the water normally lost when a vessel passed through. By 1854, the locks, described as extremely well built, were in place. After the Civil War erupted in 1861, the Union capital in Washington was unprotected as rebel forces gathered across the Potomac River. President Lincoln ordered Northern troops south, who were transported to Baltimore by rail, then marched to Camden Station to continue a rail trip to Washington. A street riot broke out, which was followed by Southern sympathizers heading north and burning the railroad bridge over the Gunpowder River, halting further train arrivals. Transport ships were quickly organized that moved the military through the C&D Canal to Annapolis, then on to Washington. The bridge was rebuilt. However, later, Major Gilmore, as his raiders entered Harford County on July 10, 1864, requisitioned goods from the store at Jerusalem Mill and then proceeded to Bush River, where the gunpowder bridge was again burned. A few days later, on July 13, 1864, the superintendent of the C&D Canal was alerted to the possibility of rebel raiders descending on Chesapeake City to destroy the canal's pumping station. Therefore, the following day, he ordered the pump to stop, thereby not producing any noise that could attract rebel attention. That raid never materialized. By 1869, total canal tonnage increased to more than 1 million for the first time ever. And in April of that year, Chesapeake City was hearing the architect's hammers greet our ears at every corner of the street, but also noting the city of Chesapeake is paved with boards, a reference to covering the muddy streets. In August, it was noted, the spirit of improvement pervades the town. New houses are going up, old houses are undergoing repairs, and persons who pass through are obliged to say, "What an enterprising people live in this little village." In 1876, the Centennial International Exhibition in Philadelphia opened, and it highlighted America's achievements over the previous 100 years. 10 million visitors, representing about 1/4 of the country's population, attended, which included members of the Hollingsworth family living in Wilna, Harford County, who most likely traveled to Philadelphia by train from their nearby Magnolia Station. Others reached the city via the C&D Canal, including Harry Moss, a reporter from Jackson, Mississippi. Moss was so impressed with the raging canal activity that he returned to Chesapeake City, establishing the Chesapeake newspaper. Its name was thought to have reflected the canal as a toll road or turnpike, but Elkton newspaper critics suggested Chesapeake was a fighting fish, and when the paper failed 2 years later, they reported it was not a fighting fish after all, but a sucker fish. James Adams, a veteran of the circus and the carnival, had a floating theater built in North Carolina in 1914 to provide entertainment to the isolated small towns along the Atlantic coast tidewater areas. It was moved by 2 tugs, the Elk and the Trooper, and came into the C&D Canal in August 1915 for 5 days, docking at Chesapeake City. It would return 9 of the next 13 years, with James and his wife Gertrude falling in love with the waterfront town, as in 1928 they settled in a retirement home on Mount Nebo Road. About 2 years later, they moved into a larger dwelling they called Linger Long. This floating theater was the inspiration for Edna Ferber's novel Showboat, which she imaginatively set on the Mississippi River with gambling. Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein visited a theater performance in Chesapeake City while writing the score for Ziegfeld's Broadway production of Showboat that opened in 1927 to rave reviews. There have been 3 movies made of Showboat, as it endures as a story of America's rich culture. The Adams are buried in Bethel Cemetery along the banks of the C&D Canal. Beginning in the late 1800s, users of the C&D Canal began urging the federal government to assume responsibility for the waterway and make it a sea-level channel. Ships larger than the 24 by 220-foot locks, or drawing more than 10 feet of water, could not use the cross-peninsular shortcut. Agitation for a larger canal finally induced President Theodore Roosevelt to appoint a commission in 1906 to study and report on the merits of a free and open waterway to connect the Chesapeake and Delaware bays. The commission, headed by General Felix Angus, reported favorably on the proposal, and the canal was purchased by the federal government in 1919 for just over $2.5 million. In 1921, the U.S. Corps of Engineers began to deepen the canal to 12 feet with a channel 90 feet wide, including 4 new highway and vertical lift bridges, 1 railroad bridge, and dredging a new eastern entrance at Reedy Point. In total, it would be necessary to excavate a whopping 16 million cubic yards of material for the new sea-level waterway. spans over the sea level canal were the vertical lift type, which normally remained in the lowered position unless a ship was passing through, whereupon cables rotating over top-mounted pulleys on both ends raised the center portion to an elevated position. Inside the platform, the bridge operator rode the movable section up and down. All of this would have to be done while allowing the old lock canal to handle cross-peninsular traffic. Finally, in 1926, the project had been completed and the old locks were removed. The Rio Motion Picture Theater was operating in Chesapeake City at the northeast end of George Street, near the C&D Canal, by at least 1936. An advertisement promoting February and March movies appeared in the Cecil Whig at that time. During one week in July, a theater placard encouraged theater attendance with the banner, "Cool Rio Theater." Years later, a canal widening would force the relocation of the structure that became a barbershop. It's perhaps somewhat ironic that the Spanish word Rio, meaning river, eventually was morphed into canal water. On the morning of July 28, 1942, the tanker Franz Classen struck one of the towers of the vertical lift bridge at Chesapeake City, completely destroying the crossing. In 1939, a similar bridge at St. George's had been hit and the onboard operator was killed. As a result, the bridge controls were relocated to the ground, so this time the operator's life was spared. Within a couple of weeks, passenger ferry service was established, operating on a 20-minute schedule. It would, however, be April 1943 before automobile ferry service would be available to keep vehicular traffic moving across the canal. The delay was precipitated by the requirement to establish ferry slip road on the south side of the canal, constructing a loading dock there on Back Creek Basin, and building a loading dock on the north side. The ferry boat Gotham served to provide vehicular traffic crossing the canal at Chesapeake City until a new bridge opened in 1949. When the vertical lift bridge was destroyed, America was in the throes of World War II, putting steel in short supply. The government was recycling scrap iron from any source available, and even the decommissioned steam engines in the water pumping station became recycling candidates. Fortunately, a Corps of Engineers official intervened by recognizing the significant historical value of the machinery, and the equipment was saved. The new bridge would have to wait until hostilities ceased in 1945 before proceeding with a design. Anticipating a future widening of the canal, the distance between the main spans was set at 540 feet, and the structure would have a total length of almost 4,000 feet. It was dedicated in 1949. Its location outside of town was vigorously opposed by Chesapeake City residents, but the chosen setting was deemed the only practical site. Now, with Chesapeake City bypassed, there was little reason for travelers to detour into the Southside Village, so its economic prosperity as once a thriving commercial center disappeared, and it fell into a slow decline. Homes and businesses became dilapidated, and as there was no reason to build new structures, many fell into disrepair, but still remained as ghosts of a time gone by. On the north side, however, the economic engines there were Schaefer's Canal House restaurant and a pilot transfer business that continued to sustain the area. In 1926, the eastern end of the canal at Delaware City had been bypassed with the Reedy Point Channel, and now it was time for Chesapeake City to experience some scars of canal improvements. For some time, the Corps of Engineers had anticipated a need to widen and deepen the waterway to accommodate larger vessels, and in doing so, they would, to the extent practical, remove some of the channel's dangerous curves. This process began in the 1960s, and a number of the houses on the south and the north side of the canal were removed. The new waterway would have a channel width of 450 feet and be 35 feet deep. Unfortunately, this governmental capital improvement would further accelerate the gradual decline of the town. A historical architect from Wilmington visited the town in 1973 and provided this interesting description. South Chesapeake City is unique in its location along the canal and has a special character because of its size, its 19th century architectural heritage, and the fact that it has not been ruined by 20th century progress. These old and sometimes run-down structures embodied a charming and unique character, and when an outside group proposed to tear some of them down and build a marina, a few of the citizens reacted. An effort was spearheaded by Mrs. Richard C. DuPont, who was known to her friends as Allaire and to her family as Babby. She was supported by Reverend James O. Reynolds and William Stubbs to place part of the South Side Chesapeake City on the National Register of Historic Places. An application was submitted on January 11, 1974, and the district was registered later in the year on July 15th. Following the registration, longtime resident Eloise Davis chaired the newly formed Historic District Commission, providing valuable guidance for the ongoing restorations of structures. Mrs. Richard C. DuPont encouraged numerous individuals and groups to invest in the rebuilding effort, leading by example and transforming the shabby Harriet Hotel into today's Bayard House restaurant. Jane Ford returned the Back Creek store to its former glory and opened it for business. One by one, houses and businesses were fixed up, and gradually the once dismal community began to take on a bright and cheerful appearance. The Chesapeake City Lions Club authorized a new resident and club member, Jack Shagna, to undertake building a replica of a wooden lighthouse that once existed at the locks and at bridge crossings over the canal. Permission was obtained from the Corps of Engineers to place it on their property near the pumping station, which had been transformed into the C&D Canal Museum. The design was based on a preserved old photograph of the lighthouse at Bethel Bridge, hence that name was placed on the structure's door. It was completed in 1996 and dedicated by Congressional Representative Wayne Gilchrist, Corps of Engineers dignitaries, the Chesapeake City mayor, and attended by the elementary school children of the town. Land paralleling the canal on the north side was leased by the Corps of Engineers to the states of Maryland and Delaware to create a multi-use trail along the canal for walkers, joggers, equestrians, and bicyclists. It encompasses approximately 16 miles of paved surface from Delaware City to Chesapeake City, which was effectively completed in 2016. It also includes the construction of 4 trailheads with amenities such as parking, information, and restrooms. In April 2023, a full-sized bronze sculpture of a mule at rest along a lock on the C&D Canal was installed in the Pell Gardens at Chesapeake City. It features a boy known as a hoggy attending the mule with a young girl feeding it a carrot. The sculpture was made possible by a gift from Jack and Signe Shagna in cooperation with the Chesapeake City District Civic Association.